during the presentation for the lecture on A Sense of the Sacred on April the 24th, Dr. McGilchrist stated that moral space is curved. The concept is intriguing indeed. An elaboration of this idea interests me. Thank you. So could you elaborate on that statement, moral space is curved?
Yes, it was a way of introducing the idea of the coincidence of opposites in morality, because of course, famously physical space is curved. But this is not just something about physical space, it's about intellectual space and our thinking and beliefs. They are not arranged as we tend to think of them nowadays in a sort of linear fashion. And if you stigmatize one aspect of something and particularly wish another contrasting aspect, you can find that by pursuing your particular goal too far, you end up achieving the exact opposite of what you intended. I mean, the most famous example of this is, which has been remarked on since the ancient days, is that too great an emphasis on liberty leads to tyranny. So what I mean is that first of all, that everything has this structure of a dipole. You cannot have dark without light. You cannot have hot without cold. And in fact, you cannot have good without evil. Not only that, but sometimes the things that we think are good may contain within them seeds of a destructive nature. And the things that we think of as necessarily bad may actually bring with them certain concealed gifts. So this is what Jung called enantiodromia, which just literally means roads going in opposite directions, which again is a nice link back to my all-time favorite philosopher, Heraclitus. You probably hear about him every time I speak, but and also he's mercifully short. I mean, he's as brief as I am long, so he's a very good antidote to reading too much McGilchrist. Anyway, he famously said, "The road up is the road down." And if you think about that in moral terms, it can be that sometimes when things get worse, in a certain sense, they're getting better. And when they're getting better, they're in a certain sense getting worse. At the moment, I think that we're very much too simple in the way in which we think about moral issues. We think of them in very stereotyped, caricatured, black and white terms with very little finesse. And the more you look at any human situation, the more you see that there are threads of many colors in there, and nothing actually in the world is in this black and white condition. Only the left hemisphere believes that things can be categorized in this and separated as polar opposites. So that was really what I was getting at there. I do think, though, that the idea of the coincidence of opposites is enormously rich. I mean, one could talk about it for a long time. And in fact, if you haven't found it, I gave a talk to Ralston College in Savannah, Georgia, an hour-long talk on the coincidence of opposites, where obviously I've got more time to say things than I have tonight. But yes, it's a very, very important question.
But what did you mean exactly by curved? Are you meaning circular in some sense? Are you meaning this whole idea of how perception works and the coming sort of, I read Dante, and he talks about this, how it comes from the outer to the center and then back again to the outer, and he's such a trickster, right? So he's difficult, but he somehow intimates that there's also another factor at play there. So when you mentioned that moral space was curved, well, I'm very interested in this because well, I shouldn't carry on, but there's Alice Rohrwacher, who's an Italian director. She maintains that the Italian people until the middle of the last century all thought in circular time. And in a very ancient kind of way. She was talking mainly of the people of the country, right? And so when you said that, it just really piqued my interest. Yes. moral space is somehow curved. So it sounded unusual to me.
Well, probably two things to say. The first is that Dante, like all great thinkers, perceived this, what nowadays and since the 19th century one would call dialectic structure of reality, that it's not a single linear bow shot. It's a process of reverberation. It's an encounter in which things are constantly moving backwards and forwards, and therefore from inner and outer, from one extreme to the other, and so on. It doesn't have the linear structure. The straight line would be the only image that would enable these things to get further and further apart, whereas I believe they're constantly coming back together. And my reason for saying circular is that, of course, if you set off like Columbus and sail west, eventually you'll come back east and come back to where you started from. But there is a more interesting point to make about circular shape. I think shapes are a very interesting, non-negligible way of thinking about ideas. And I repeatedly come back to the image of a spiral, which is actually also there in that wonderful painting of the spiral shape of Jacob's Ladder by Blake, which we use as the emblem of the channel. And the thing about a spiral is that it does come back, but it doesn't come back to quite the same place. A circle is, in a way, for all that you can move around it, is somewhat static. It can't progress. You simply are locked into an alternation. Whereas the thing about a spiral is it slightly misses each time it comes around and goes on in another dimension and repeats the shape. And if you look at a spiral down the axis of the spiral, it looks exactly like a circle. But if you look at it through another perspective, through 90 degrees, then you see something that is actually not symmetrical and static, but is actually constantly moving onwards. And that's probably the better image for all these things. It's a difficult one to do briefly. Empedocles, another great pre-Socratic philosopher, thought that all stemmed from the alternation of two forces, one of love and the other of strife. And this is rather like Goethe's idea that everything comes from a combination of a force for division and individuation and a force for union. The only thing, I completely agree with that, and I think Goethe is an unsurpassed philosopher, so I quote him and agree with him a great deal. But the thing that one needs to notice is that the next level up, union and division, well, should they be divided or should they be united? The answer is they must be united. So in a sense, there is an asymmetry between union and division in which union trumps division. And this is rather like the relationship between the two hemispheres, which appear to be, well, they are asymmetrical, actually, literally, in almost every sense, but they seem to be perhaps a balanced pair, but they're not, because the right hemisphere understands and can take into account what the left hemisphere can tell us, but the left hemisphere can't do that in reverse. It can't understand the right hemisphere, it doesn't know what the right hemisphere sees. So, in fact, yesterday I was having a debate in Oxford with a physicist and a physician, Dennis Noble, about the relationship between symmetry and the coming together, the coincidence of opposites. And I heard just before we came on air that that is now available somewhere online.
Thank you.
It is, yes. And those two lectures that Ian mentioned, the one with Ralston College on the coincidence of opposites and the one that was hosted by How to Academy yesterday evening, they're all on YouTube, so you can find them on there.